Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of the week's lectures on medicine in ancient China. I hope you're all doing okay and that you've enjoyed the things we've been talking about so far this week. If you'll recall, to this point, we've learned a little bit about the Han Dynasty, specifically the tradition of cosmological medicine it birthed. And last class, we had a chance to look at an excerpt from the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, which is one of China's foundational medical texts. We noticed that this excerpt contained lots of references to bodies, both the individual body and the body politic, and thereafter we embarked on an exploration into the field that is called body studies. As a result of our discussions, hopefully, we've come to see that in addition to being flesh and blood things, bodies are symbolic constructs. That is, they are conceptually complex things. Instead of being biological givens, they are mediated by and through cultural sign systems. In what follows today, I'd like to continue down this path a bit more, and to do so, I want us to turn to the work of Shigehise Kuriyama. Kuriyama is an historian of medicine at Harvard University, and in 1999, he published this really path-breaking book that's called The Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine. This book is kind of a big deal. Kuriyama has won a bunch of awards for it, and it's been translated into Chinese, Greek, Spanish, and Korean. As the title suggests, one of the things that Kuriyama's concerned with here is the divergent historical trajectories of Greek and Chinese medicine. In comparing the diagnostic and therapeutic features of these two medical systems, Kuriyama finds that over time, Greek and Chinese medicine became more and more different. His explanation for why these two traditions diverged revolves around bodies. Even though we tend to think of the body as a universal entity, something that is basic and fundamental to life, something that all humans have in common, when we look at the writings of doctors from these two civilizations, Kuriyama argues, we see that their perceptions and their representations of the body were totally alien to each other. This, he argues, was a result of the very different ways ancient Greek and Chinese doctors touched, sensed, and experienced the human body. Thus, as his research shows, the human body is not an unproblematic universal entity. Human bodies are products of society and culture. In particular, medicine plays a huge role in shaping our experiences of our physical constitutions. As evidence of the different ways these two medical cultures perceive the body, consider the two images on the screen here. On the left, we're looking at a sketch of the human body by Andreas Vesalius, a famous Italian anatomist of the 16th century. On the right, we see another sketch of the human body, this one by the famous 14th century Chinese physician Hua Shou. Comparing these two images, you probably notice that they are at least a little bit different. Most notably, while Vesalius's body is incredibly muscular, Hua Shou's features no muscles whatsoever. In addition to this, Hua Shou's body has numerous acupuncture points. Vesalius's doesn't have any of these. You may also notice that while Vesalius's drawing depicts anatomical structures that exist underneath the skin, Hua Shou's remains on the surface of the body. And lastly, while we might call Hua Shou's body a fairly rotund, flabby one, Vesalius's is taut and lean. What explains these differences? When they drew up their respective sketches, Vesalius and Hua Shou were looking at the same thing. It's not as if one is drawing a bear and the other is drawing a human. They're both humans. Also, we can't explain the differences between these images as a product of the artist's perspective or vantage point. Both of these guys were looking at an adult male in an upright, standing position head on. So, why doesn't Vesalius's body have acupuncture points? Or why doesn't Hua Shou's have muscles? These are the kinds of mysteries Kuriyama attempts to solve in his book. And over the course of this lecture, we'll see exactly how he does this. But first, to clarify, our questions for today are as follows. 1. How did ancient and Chinese and Greek views of the body differ? And 2. Why did they differ? All right, so I want to give you one particular example that Kuriyama discusses in a chapter of his book. In this chapter, he notes that one of the biggest differences between the medical systems of ancient Greece and ancient China had to do with bloodletting. From Galen onward in the West, bloodletting, which is also known as phlebotomy, was one of the central remedies in the Western therapeutic toolkit. By the 18th century, it had become the preferred treatment for a wide range of disorders. By contrast, in China, bloodletting became less common over time. There are scattered references to this in very ancient texts, where doctors performed a procedure that is called bianxi. But by the time of the Han Dynasty, bloodletting had gone into decline, and gradually bianxi disappeared completely. So, why was this? What caused this particular divergence between Chinese and Greek medicine? The answer has to do with different conceptions of the body, and in particular, different explanations of what caused bodies to become ill. In ancient Greece and Rome, the rising popularity of bloodletting owed to fears of excess blood. This was something that doctors were literally obsessed with. Inflammation was thought to be a key cause of disease, and this was thought to result from a condition called plethora, literally too much blood. Galen, the Roman doctor, traced cancerous lesions and tumorous growths back to plethora, and other doctors saw this as the cause of all illness. When doctors encountered patients who reported feeling heavy and sluggish, or who were experiencing tension in the limbs, pain, lassitude, general tiredness, they commonly diagnosed plethora, which they believed to develop from things like overeating, not getting enough exercise, not sleeping properly, or from sexual overindulgence. Common treatments for this included fasting and exercise, but if those didn't work, then the solution was bloodletting. Today, it's hard for us to imagine excess blood being anything more than a rare oddity. It is certainly not something we diagnose in people today. But in the ancient Greco-Roman world, it was the beginning and ending of all medical thought and practice. Indeed, the ancient Western medical body was a plethoric body. As Galen put it, quote, "If a tiny wound swells massively with pus, it must be because of a pre-existing plethora of unevacuated residues. In bodies without excess, even large gashes heal quickly without inflammation and festering." Ancient Chinese doctors had no anxieties about plethora. They agreed that as food was the ultimate source of blood, overeating could lead to hemorrhages and inflammations. There was even a disease in the Chinese medical lexicon that resembled plethora. It was called shi. It literally meant fullness, and it was said to lead to painful swellings, pustulent ulcers, and perhaps even tumors. Importantly, however, shi was not thought of as a problem of the blood. And more importantly, it was no more than a minor concern. Chinese doctors were not haunted by this idea of an overabundance of blood threatening to overwhelm the body and sink it into a place of disease and death. What worried them was not she, but its opposite, shu, literally emptiness. If Greek reflections upon sickness began with plethora, Chinese reflections began with depletion and emptiness. As evidence of this, consider the following passage from an ancient Chinese medical text called the Suwen. As this passage makes clear, for ancient Chinese thinkers, fullness was health, and emptiness was sickness. This was the exact opposite of what the ancient Greeks thought. According to them, a body that was full was one that the menaces of the outside world could harm. But for the Chinese, these external dangers posed the greatest threat to the empty, depleted body. Consider this passage from the Ling Shu, another ancient Chinese medical text. Quote, "If wind, rain, cold, or heat don't encounter a depletion of bodily vitality, their Xia Qi alone can't harm people. When one unexpectedly experiences a windstorm or rainstorm and doesn't become ill, the reason must be that there is not depletion, and the Xi Qi alone can't harm people. Only when a depleting wind encounters a depletion within the body can the wind possess the body." As this makes clear, in a body brimming with blood and other stuff, there was no room for noxious presences. So here we see that there was one point of agreement between ancient Chinese and Greek doctors. Both believed that health was largely dependent on one's inner condition. Both said things like harsh winds and bruises really only harm those who were already sick, or at least who were predisposed to illness because of their bodily states. For the Greeks, what caused this predisposition was excessive eating and a body full of corrupting residues. For the Chinese, by contrast, this predisposition was caused by emptiness, by squandered vitality. The split between bloodletting and acupuncture, then, was a product of Greek and Chinese doctors' different contrasting fears. For the Greeks, there was fear of retention. For the Chinese, it was all about a fear of loss. As Kuriyama concludes, quote, "Whereas Greek medicine emphasized the benefits of menstruation, nosebleeds, and hemorrhoids as a way to forestall or relieve excess, Chinese physicians saw little good in nosebleeds or hemorrhages. They simply tried to stop them." All of this gets us back to understanding the images we began this lecture with. You might be wondering, why were the Greeks so intent on displaying muscularity? Why did muscles feature so prominently in their sketches of the human body? At first glance, we might be tempted to say that this simply reflected the state of Greek anatomical knowledge. For after all, we know that Greek scientists and doctors, including Aristotle and Galen, performed dissections. However, one thing we have to make note of here is that dissections weren't done for medical reasons. Surgery, remember, was not a major part of the healer's art in ancient Greece. Instead, dissections were done in order to get a glimpse of the divine. And here I just want to read you a passage from Galen to underscore this point. He writes, quote, "I have frequently dissected such creeping animals as cats and mice, and crawling things as the snake, and many kinds of birds and fishes. This I do to convince myself that there was a single mind that fashioned them, and that the body is suited in all ways to the character of the animal." As this indicates, the impetus to anatomatize manifested a kind of spiritual religious desire. To be sure, anatomical investigations certainly made the Greeks aware of muscles, but the reason their depictions of the human body are so full of bulging biceps has more to do with broader cultural attitudes. For them, muscles signified strength, bravery, virtue, and courage. They signified the warlike character of the Greek people. The Greeks connected their muscles to their political ideals of freedom and independence, as can be seen in this passage from the Airs, Waters, and Places text of Hippocrates. All right, that's all we have time for now. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. See you next time.